Hey, y'all. So we're now looking at the part two, the collapse of the Grand Alliance. We just kind of developed the Grand Alliance, and I hope you noticed that despite the romantic hope for the Grand Alliance, it was more of a coalition against the Axis powers. And that coalition clearly was crumbling by the time we get to Potsdam. But after Potsdam, we're now going to see how this collapsed. And I really like this political cartoon. This political cartoon really demonstrates the idea who, according to this cartoonist, who's at fault for the Cold War. Yeah, I hope you notice that Stalin. Stalin is this is about aggrandizement. He's reaching, and even in this political cartoon, we see here they're looking at the concept of Sweden, France. These are areas in which what's going to happen here is France going to fall to communism? And there was this general fear. There was a general fear that communism would continue to spread until it was stopped. And really important element. And let's go ahead and look at it. Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe. It all began with the Red Army, where this is so similar to the end of the Napoleonic Wars when the Russian army dominated all parts of Poland, forcing the principle of compensation. This is exactly the same thing. The Red Army, wherever the Red Army has liberated, it is now occupying. So almost every Eastern European country, from Poland all the way down to Albania, with the exception of Yugoslavia, is occupied by the Red Army. And wherever the Red Army is, that's where the Iron Curtain will fall. And I like this image. This image really demonstrates how the Red Army is taking victory. They're here in East Germany, spread the idea that flag, this is now ours. Uh, Poland, remember Poland, that was in explicitly enumerated in the Yalta Agreement. Poland is the London Poles are just out of luck. They're going to remain in London. The London Poles firmly have become behind what we might call the proverbial Iron Curtain. And everywhere the Red Army was, a little Stalin was put in place. And a little Stalin, these are communist dictators handpicked by Stalin to create a Stalin like dictatorship. From Romania to Albania, all the way up to Poland, we begin to see what we call these little Stalins, and they're denying the people of those areas of their self-determination. And maybe the most famous one that occurred here is in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia in 1947, the prime minister proclaimed that they were open to support from the United States with the Marshall Plan that's going to develop. And there was what we call the Czech coup. The Czech coup is when the Red Army came in and arrested all of the leaders, including the prime minister, and they would never be seen again. So Eastern Europe clearly now is occupied and solidified in a Eastern Bloc mentality. And this is when 1947, the infamous or famous Iron Curtain speech. Here we see this is a great political cartoon. Here we see Winston Churchill. He is the one who, in a famous speech in Independence, Missouri, he declared that an Iron Curtain has fallen on Eastern Europe. And from Elbe to Trieste, he defies us. And I really like this political cartoon because you can really see how it's from a Western point of view. It's no admittance by the order of Joe Stalin. You see on the other side all the industrialization happening, but it clearly is this idea of a line of demarcation that is separating. And up to 1948, there's a big question: what's going to happen here? Is that really going to be an Iron Curtain, or does that become a battlefront? And that all begins to unfold as we see this. Right after World War II, there were these communist insurgencies in Greece and Turkey. And there was a fear that, yes, the Red Army has what they got, but are the democracies of Turkey and Greece, quote unquote democracies, are they going to remain part of that Western bloc? And by 1947, communist insurgents were gaining support in both Turkey and Greece, and there was a general fear that they were about to fall. They were going to fall, and the United States feared that all of Europe was about to collapse to communism. It's, if we think about it, if we compare this maybe to the end of World War One, and in World War One there was a Red Scare, the fear of Bolshevism. We think about the Spartacus Revolt. We think about maybe Bela Kun in Hungary. There was a general fear, and that's when the Big Three really created a series of compromises to solidify Western Europe. Well, that's kind of what's going to have to happen here. What is the United States going to do to prevent the spread of communism? And President Truman is really going to focus on Greece and Turkey at first. And what happens by the end of 1947, we have the official policy of containment. The policy of containment is the belief that if you block the spread of communism, the communism in itself will kill itself. And containment, it's almost like if we stop the spread of cancer, cancer will eat itself up. And that's how containment viewed communism. That communism doesn't necessarily want to lead a war, but it's going to spread to wherever we let it spread. So the policy of containment, it's not an aggressive policy, but it's an assertive policy. We're going to stop at the agreement lines. And in March 1947, we get the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine, here we see part of this famous speech, State of the Union speech, in which he unfolded this. He argued that it was the United States' responsibility to protect the freedom of democracies throughout the world. And this is a really important turn of events, right? So if we can, again, look back at the end of World War One, the United States pulled back into isolation, and that isolationism is what created the atmosphere for the rise of Hitler, for the rise of Mussolini, all of those bad things leading us to World War II. Truman completely believed that that was the fault of the United States, and that the Republicans inside the Senate who rejected Versailles they're the responsible. So Truman now is conveying to the people, this is a public speech, the State of the Union, the audience is the United States people, and he is trying to convince them that it is time for them to buckle up and accept higher taxes. Because if we're going to become the policemen of the world, we're going to need to expand our military. And the Truman Doctrine is that. The Truman Doctrine is that we're going to militarily support the free peoples of Turkey and of Greece and of any other country in the world that is fighting against communist insurgents. So a really important element, this begins this complete 180 of traditional U.S. policy. And instead of retreating into isolationism, we are going to push forward and say, we are going to stop the spread of communism. And then later that year, we get the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan, again, is that it cements this 180-degree change in foreign policy from 1919 to the moments now. Because remember, in the 1920s, one of the reasons why there was a reparation crisis, the Ruhr crisis, is because the United States forced France to pay off their debt, in which they then needed reparation from Germany. Not only did the United States agree to forgive all World War II debt, the Marshall Plan is an economic recovery plan that's going to send American capital into Europe. We're going to help rebuild the infrastructure of England, of France, even of Portugal, of parts of Italy, of Western Germany, because we want to make sure that they have an economic recovery, and that economic recovery will secure them so that Stalin and his communism would not be able to take advantage or encroach upon it. So by the time we get to 1948, there's been a complete 180 of U.S. foreign policy. Instead of the predictable isolationism in which I think Stalin was thinking that was going to happen, instead, the United States is fully engaged into stopping the spread of communism. But we are not going to attack communism. That's a really important difference between an aggressive policy and an assertive policy. An aggressive policy might say, let's roll back communism. No, no, no. We're going to respect the agreements that were made. And that Iron Curtain is going to be the point. Now, this is going to take us right to the Berlin crisis. And this is the exclamation point at the collapse of the Grand Alliance. The Grand Alliance, by the time we get to 1949, clearly no longer exists. It is over with, and now we're in this Cold War rivalries. And I want to point out, well, when they partitioned Germany at Yalta and Potsdam, the agreement would be they're going to, right here where my little cursor is, this area here, this is Berlin, and Berlin will be partitioned in 4 areas as well. You'd have the red one over here is the Soviet, United States, England, and France. And by the time we get to 1948, Truman, who's playing he's beginning to play hardball here. He is not willing to step back. He is not going to embrace appeasement. He is looking at the most recent history at the Munich conference and said, we cannot allow for totalitarianism to spread like appeasement allowed for the spread of Nazism. So he's like, hey, the agreement was we get West Berlin, we get West Berlin. Well, if you're Stalin, where's Berlin? It's in the middle of East Germany. So, of course, you're going to think that, predictably, that they're going to leave and all parts of Berlin will become absorbed into East Germany. By 1948, East Germany is becoming an independent state. The United Nations is going to recognize both West Germany and East Germany. So, of course, that's what's going to happen. Well, not only do they resist, the three zones that are British, French, and American, they unite into what we might call Trizonia, but those 3 areas united into West Berlin. And West Berlin, this is going to become the Berlin crisis. Berlin plays a significant role in the rest of the Cold War, especially up to 61, but then also at the outcome. What we see here is West Berlin is going to remain in Western hands, or at least that's what Truman thinks. And they actually introduce a Western-style currency there, and West Berlin becomes basically a window of capitalism behind the Iron Curtain. So Stalin's like, nope, don't think so. So Stalin's like, hey, you need to withdraw. The United States said, no, this is ours. Truman's like, clearly, we're not going to back down. So instead of Stalin becoming aggressive, what he did, he's ordered what we call the Berlin blockade. And the Berlin blockade is when the Soviet tanks and military cut off all land routes into West Berlin. So no resources can go from West Germany to West Berlin via the train. And really the whole goal of the Berlin blockade was to starve West Berlin starve them into submission. And that the only thing the West Berliners could do was convert their West Berlin currency into East German currency. And then once the West Berlin currency is gone, that means the West Berlin economy is gone. And then in essence, West Berlin would be absorbed. This is a pretty smart plan. Stalin thinks it's going to happen. Stalin realizes he's not going to attack because if there's going to be a war, the West is going to start it, not us, he would say. And he thinks that this is going to go over well. Well, this is when Truman has an emergency meeting. And the world is fearful. There's World War III. There was actually a advisor to Truman who said we need to militarize the train and go in and go with our guns ablazing. And Truman's like, I think I'm going to pass on that. Because Truman realized Did the world want World War III? Was the United States willing to send their next generation into a war that's going to kill them all, just like they've seen so many people die in World War II? And the answer was no. And instead, we get the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift, Truman declared the United States and Britain would provide West Berlin with resources through the air. Pretty dramatic thing here. They realized, looking at the calories, they had to have a certain amount of tonnage each day brought in. And what would happen here? Here we see um, the American. I think this is the British are up here. This is the American airplanes. They're gonna be landing planes every 6 to 7 minutes, if not quicker. And when they drop those planes, they park the planes, they unload the planes, they get back on the planes, and they shoot out. There's a constant bombardment, if you will, of these B-52 bombers that are coming in, but instead of bombing, they're bringing in resources, and then those resources really important. By the time we get to 1949, it was clear that the United States had the technology to overcome the blockade. Stalin did not have the resources to continue the blockade, and the Berlin Airlift was the first significant victory for the United States during this beginnings of the Cold War. And really, by 1948, by the crisis, the end of this crisis, the Cold War is clearly started. What happens here? Germany officially became two separate states, West and East Germany. West Germany's right here. This is East Germany. The Iron Curtain was unofficially recognized. I really want to significantly emphasize that. Unofficially means there's no paperwork, there's no treaty, but clearly the United States has recognized the Soviet sphere of influence, and the Soviet Union has clearly recognized the American sphere of influence. So, with that said, there's a predictability. The Soviet Union can do whatever it wants on its side of the Iron Curtain. And what happens to really formalize this? The United States organizes NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and we see. I love this map I have here. You see, these are the first countries: Iceland, Norway, Denmark, Britain, France, the Benelux countries, Italy, and Portugal. They're agreeing basically to be satellite states of the United States, and I do think that's the best way we can look at it. So by the time we get to 1949. Clearly, Western Europe is the United States sphere of influence, and the NATO countries in Europe are willing to surrender some of its sovereignty, not all of its sovereignty, but some of their sovereignty, in hopes to provide a sense of stability. Really significant there. And that's going to bring us to our next part. I'm going to pause here.